Welcome to Greenwood's Legal's Employment Law Nowcast, episode 9. This is the one about holiday pay. Enjoy the podcast. Hello and welcome to our latest Employment Law Nowcast. There have been some developments in relation to holiday pay, so we thought we'd have a chat about that today. And it seems that there have been so many decisions about various elements of holiday pay. We thought it would be worth a quick reminder of kind of the potted history of the recent changes that have happened. What was the original position in terms of calculating holiday pay?
Yeah, so without wishing to feel too old about it, back in the old days, people could roll up holiday pay. So if people were working irregular hours in one way or another, it was fairly standard to calculate people's holiday as a proportion of the time they were working. And instead of giving them holiday, just paying them for an additional sum for the holiday that they would have accrued in that period. That was called rolled up holiday pay. That went on for quite a long time. And then that was outlawed, I think, back in about 2006. Rolled up holiday pay was outlawed because it was identified that people should actually be taking holiday, and it was a big health and safety issue, really, for the EU in particular. The ECJ were quite hot on the fact that people should actually be encouraged to take their holiday rather than just be paid for it.
It was quite a big deal at the time. I remember talking to lots of clients about that because, just as a matter of course, that is what they did. And so having that come in was quite a massive change, and in quite a lot of the sort of industries that we give a lot of advice on, it was just a standard practice. I remember it being quite a significant change.
Yeah. Any organisation where you had people that were really working irregular hours, it just seemed to make more sense. But the law changed, and you couldn't roll up people's holiday pay anymore, and there was a sense to that. The next big change really came with a case a couple of years ago, which I seem to have talked about for years now, in its various iterations, the case of Brazil and Harper Trust. And that was a case about um, a music teacher in a school, and it was about how her holiday was calculated. And without going into the fine details, what the school were doing was calculating her holiday based on the fact that she didn't work every week of the year. So they were prorating down her holiday to reflect the weeks that she actually worked. Um, and that went through the courts. She objected to that calculation, and it was determined ultimately that the way you should calculate holiday for someone who works part of the year, and based on the way the working time regulations have been drafted, even if you're only working a few weeks of the year, if you're a permanent employee, then you were entitled to the full 5.6 weeks of statutory holiday that everyone else was entitled to, even though you may only be working, a handful of weeks a year or 30 weeks a year. You are still entitled to your holiday to be calculated on the basis that you're entitled to 5.6 weeks every year, like everyone else.
Am I right in thinking that that was the move away from the 12.07% calculation that we'd seen quite a lot of? And Harper Trust was the case that said, no, look at the regulations. That's quite clear that these types of people are entitled to the 5.6 weeks.
Yeah, that's right. So when people were rolling up holiday pay, the normal calculation that was used was 12.07%. That seems like a weirdly specific calculation to use, but that's what you get if you work out what proportion of a total year 5.6 weeks is. And 5.6 weeks is the statutory minimum holiday. So if you work out that people, every hour they work, 12.07 of that, they are accruing as holiday, and then you extrapolate that over days or weeks or months of work, then using 12.07 seemed a sensible approach for calculating people's holiday when they weren't working
And
regular hours.
and I guess before the sort of Harper Trust case, I think everybody thought that seemed sensible. I
Yep.
mean, obviously, as you say, the rolled up holiday pay thing had disappeared, but I think it seemed pretty reasonable that you would accrue holiday for for the weeks that you work, not for weeks that you don't work. So I guess
Yeah.
Harper Trust was another massive change.
Yeah, it was a huge change for anyone that was employing people on a less regular basis. So there were weeks where they weren't working. Harper Trust was a huge change because the way you calculate holiday under the working time regulations is that every time someone has, and let's just talk about days of holiday. So every time someone has a day of holiday, they're entitled to be paid that at their normal rate of pay. Now, the tricky thing is that when you're looking at what someone's normal rate of pay is, you look at what they earn in any given week. So far, so good. That seems to make sense. So you look at what they earn normally, and that's the amount that they are entitled to for each day of holiday. The difficulty is that when you're looking at what people earn in a normal week and you're going back because people have got erratic hours, you look back and see what they earn on each week, but every week they don't do any work at all, you ignore. So, say someone works full time exactly 26 weeks of the year, so half of the year, and they've been doing that for the last couple of years. When you work out what their holiday entitlement is, you ignore every single week when they haven't done any work at all and only look at the weeks when they work. So, when they then take a week off, that is paid at their full normal working week amount. Now, if you compare that to someone who works part time but works every week of the year, so say someone who works exactly half time but works 52 weeks of the year, when they take holiday and you work it out, you don't discount any of those weeks, you count every single week. So the way the Harper Trust ruling ends up with holiday pay being calculated, if you've got one person that works 26 weeks of the year, 1 week on, 1 week off, and works full time on the weeks they work, but not at all in the other week, they're entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday paid at their full working weekly working rate. Whereas the employee who works exactly the same number of hours in the week but works half time every single week is entitled to be paid for that week's holiday at their normal working week, which is half of that which the other employee gets. So it creates this sort of huge disparity, and there's this sort of real problem. And it looks rationally like there's a real problem with the calculation basis. And so we were all rather pleased as employers and people that advise employers that um, in the back end of last year, when the government were introducing new rules that were allowed to be used because of allowed to be introduced because of Brexit and us not being tied to quite the same rules anymore. Um, One of the first things that they suggested was that there was going to be a change to these rules that would affect part year workers, and it would effectively reverse the effect of the Brazil and Harper Trust case, and that looked promising. And at the back end of last year, we got the regulations, and we had a look at those, and they looked okay. But um, earlier, just after Christmas, we got guidance that came out that explained what those rules really meant, and that's what we're here really to talk about today. That brings us right up to date. Do the new regulations that have been introduced do what we thought they were going to do in reversing Brazil and Harper Trust?
And I suppose, particularly in light of the fact that it seemed like the Harper Trust case was slightly illogical, produced some of those strange results. So the expectation is that this new regulation would then reverse all of that and put us back to where we needed to be, where everything is nice and logical. But unfortunately, that may not be the case.
Yeah, there are two kind of main definitions within the regulations and the guidance that we wanted to talk about, where I think I'm right in saying that the regulations say that this a minimum in some cases of this 12.07% calculation can be used, and that's in relation to irregular hours workers and part year workers. But as has just been alluded alluded to, you've got to really dig down into those definitions in order to fully appreciate the scope of these changes, if at all. I've got them here. So, shall we start with irregular hours workers? That says a worker is an irregular hours worker in relation to a leave year if the number of paid hours that they will work in each pay period during the term of their contract in that year is, under the terms of their contract, wholly or mostly variable. And I think it's fair to say that's not what you would normally expect if you were to kind of naturally think of what an irregular hours worker might be.
No, it's a there's a definition. Of course, all these definitions in legislation are going to be wordy and legalistic. But the trouble you get is when you start digging into that definition. So the example I always trot out on this is my daughter, who, when she's not at university, works at a well-known fast food establishment. When she was at home before she went off to university, she worked for that restaurant on the basis that she would work 2 hours, so 2 shifts a week, every week, and those shifts were always 5 hours. But when she worked them was a complete mystery. So she would give a schedule of times that she could be available, and then she would be put on for whatever shifts worked for the restaurant. And so, sometimes she'd be doing an afternoon shift, sometimes she'd be doing an evening shift. It could be any day of the week, any 7 days a week. Under the definition that Micheala just read out to us there, she was not an irregular hours worker at that point, because the key, and this is really flushed out by the guidance that the government have produced, the key point that stops her being an irregular hours worker is her actual hours. The number of hours per week was fairly regular. She knew that she would be working 10 hours a week. Sometimes she'd work 3 shifts, occasionally she'd only work 1 shift, but by and large she was working 2 5-hour shifts a week. And what the guidance makes clear is that it doesn't matter when you work those hours. What you look at is if your hours are mainly regular, and that means how many hours are mainly regular, then you're not an irregular hours worker. So in that case, she wasn't an irregular hours worker. So all of the rules that we're going to look at towards the end of this podcast about what you can then do with people's holiday pay wouldn't apply to her in that scenario.
And I think it's fair to say that there's also a similar theme with the other definition of part-year workers, which is more relevant to the Harper Trust case because Ms. Brazel was a part-year worker. I'll read it out. There's a bit that's in the legislation, then a bit that's been added on in the guidance. So the legislation says a worker is a part-year worker in relation to a leave year if, under the terms of their contract, they are required to work only part of that year, and there are periods within that year during the term of the contract of at least a week which they are not required to work and for which they are not paid. And then the guidance says this includes part-year workers who may have fixed hours, for example, teaching assistants who only work during term time and who are paid only when working. So I think there's a few things to pick out there, particularly the relationship between the not working and not being paid.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key thing in relation to this, because I think we probably expected this to deal with the sort of issue in relation to teachers who, may not work for a significant period, for example, over the summer or whatever, but they may be paid during that period. But because this definition relates both to periods of work and pay, the guidance then gives examples that make it very clear that even if you're not working during a period, but you're paid for that period, so that would encompass people who have a kind of flat rate of salary or whatever that's paid over 12 months, even though there might be several months that they don't actually work, that would mean that they don't fall into the part-year worker definition. So that kind of excludes quite a lot of people that we thought might be included in that definition, and therefore kind of redress some of the problems with the logic of the Harper Trust decision.
And that is really common, isn't it? Just to pick up on the flat rate point that you were talking about, flat rate or annualised contracts. From our experience, kind of advising clients in, for example, the independent school sector, almost all teachers that we've come across are on an annualised contract, which it seems strange, doesn't it? That looking and drilling down into this definition, it doesn't address the problem that we thought it might.
Yeah, you'd think the classic part-year worker would be the teacher,
Mm.
and they are expressly not a part-year worker according to the new legislation.
I think it's actually quite unusual, I think, to find part-year workers who are regularly part-year workers, but they're only paid and only work the time when they're working, rather than having some kind of umbrella arrangement that goes over the whole year.
I suppose is one example, like a very casual workers, like fruit pickers, that kind of thing. Maybe agricultural workers that are only needed at certain points during the year.
I mean, certainly I've come across situations, for example, in the travel industry where people are brought in the peak season, in kind of immediately after Christmas and that kind of period, in order to sell holidays, that kind of thing. And they won't necessarily then have a contract which lasts for the rest of the year. So they're a bit more like, yeah, seasonal workers more than anything else. But I think it is really surprising that it's as limited as it is, this
Yeah,
definition.
and those people, like the people you just referred to, weren't being caught by the Harper Trust ruling
No.
anyway, because it only referred to people who had permanent contracts, so contracts that went throughout the whole year. And yeah, as you say, John, the number of people who are contracted like that but only get paid when they're working are vanishingly small. Really, this it doesn't feel like these definitions are doing certainly what we expect them to do. Whether they're doing what they're intended to do is a different matter, but what we expected them to do, it doesn't feel like they're achieving it.
And we've been, for this reason, we've been having some discussions about, for example, if we have a teacher, is there anything that can be done in terms of their contract maybe to almost get around this? Because there's reference in the definition of if they have at least a week which they are not required to work and for which they are not paid, then they would fall into the definition of part-year worker subject to the other stuff. But there's not really anything we
Well,
can immediately think of, I don't think.
you'd have to end up doing stuff that was so contrived,
Yeah.
like telling your teacher who is really on a 12-month contract that, all right, so we're all going to say that for the first 2 weeks of August, you mustn't do any work and you won't get paid for that, but we'll make up the rest of the money during the rest of the year. It just looks like a device to get around this legislation, but that's outside of doing something like that, it's really difficult to see how you could fit in what you might imagine should fit into these regulations into the regulations. And in a way, it's a real shame because the work that's gone into actually what it means if you are a part-year worker or an irregular hours worker is pretty good. Yeah, there's very sensible stuff about how you then calculate holiday pay, what can be carried over in terms of holiday and what can't. But the actual number of employees that's going to apply to seems really small because the definitions are so narrowly drafted.
It'll be interesting to see whether we do end up getting queries and that kind of thing about these kind of artificial arrangements and employers trying to potentially get around these slightly odd nuances as a result of the guidance. But until then, I think that's everything we had to say in relation to this update about holiday pay. I'm sure there might be more in the future, but thank you for watching.